Hi, good afternoon. Hi, thanks so much for coming out. My name's Eleanor and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Big Questions. Thanks so much for coming along. Big Questions, if you haven't been before, is a chance each week to look at basically a big question relating to life or purpose or meaning. And this week we're looking at the really big question of climate change and whether or not God has anything to say to that. So we're going to have a talk from Sam Barker. He's going to help us start to think through that. Then there's going to be some time for discussion around tables, and then we'll have a question and answer time after that. So Sam Barker studied here at Cambridge, and he now works as a political campaigner focusing on the environment. He's worked in Parliament and for campaigning NGOs, and he's now the director of the Conservative Environment Network, which promotes conservative environmentalism. So do text in your questions throughout the talk. The number that you need for that is on the stand here and on the pillars around. That's for the question and answer time. So without further ado, Sam Barker.
I really should have rigged up some sort of abseil. That would have been a cool entry. So if you take away one truth from this talk, I want it to be this. God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with some naked vegetarians. When I look at the stories that begin the Christian scriptures, that's the conclusion I come to. I don't know what expectations, or if you'll permit me, misconceptions you might have of Christianity. But I think that's probably God's baseline. Hanging out in a garden, just created the world, and naked vegetarians. Sweet. So with that image in your mind, I want to talk about three things today. Question at the top of the bill, which is, what does God think about climate change? What solutions might he offer? And also, why might Christianity be exploring? Why might Christianity be worth exploring if you want to succeed as a climate campaigner? So just to talk about myself, I'm Sam, as I said. I went to Christ's a while ago. I still live in Cambridge, which is a bit like being Dorian Gray's picture. Any English students out there? No, obviously not. You get older and you watch English students come in at 18 and it stays the same and life's bad. I used to make the sandwiches for these talks as well, so it was really nice to be on the receiving end of that. About 10 years ago, my life's been pretty circulated around Cambridge. About 10 years ago, I proposed on King's Backs, and the wonderful Xanthi took me on, and we have two little children called Alethea and Nathaniel. And for 13 years since graduating, I've worked in and around politics, mostly conservative politics. I worked for an MP, then a few think tanks and development and humanitarian NGOs. I'll just point out to start with, I'm a political and a policy person. I'm not a scientist by background. I'm not a kind of full-time Christian worker. So when it comes to questions, I might not have all the answers, but Cambridge is good at providing answers, or at least giving you space to ask the questions. 4 years ago, I started working for a charity called Tear Fund, which is a big development and humanitarian charity down in London. And about kind of in the 90s, they started to recognize that the people they worked with around the world, they work in 40 countries, trying to work with the poorest communities there. Those people were being impacted by an environment under strain. So rains that used to be predictable for mostly smallholder farmers became unpredictable. Crops wouldn't grow properly. Floods came more intensely and more unexpectedly. And as people become desperate when their crops fail, they exacerbate these problems. They go out, they dig up trees to create firewood or charcoal, and that means more soil washes away, less nitrogen and carbon is fixed in the soil, the yields and the productivity go down. Now, as a development agency, you can do stuff locally to help that. You can help people do new irrigation patterns. You can give people access to kind of weather forecasting technology. You can create insurance products that give them routes out of that. But actually, Tear Fund recognised that the problems there are caused upstream. It's the behaviour of the wealthier end of the world that is driving some of these shifts in the weather patterns. And so then in the late 90s, Tier Fund, an explicitly Christian organisation, decided it would start campaigning on climate change. And I did that with them for 3 years. And in the course of that, I saw the impacts of climate on the poor in Brazil, in Bangladesh, in Sierra Leone. And I enjoyed that. I wanted to get a bit closer to the political world, and that's why I moved over to do this conservative environmental stuff. I'm not sure how much news pops the Cambridge bubble these days, but it's a reasonably interesting time for conservative politics, which I'm sure might come up in the questions. Anyway, that's me. Our question today, what does God say to climate change? Well, I should put the caveat on that I can't really speak for God. Humility. You'll kind of have to ask him yourself, and Christians call that prayer, and you know, that's down to you. But I'm going to go out on a limb. If I don't get struck by lightning, we'll run with it and say that actually I think God probably hates climate change. I think he hates the impact it's having on his creation and on his people, and he hates the selfishness that's driving it. And I get this from the Bible. God cares about creation. As he creates the world in Genesis 1, I don't know if you've read that story, but you have each day and something new comes through. And at the end it says, and God said it was good. And then you have this story in the middle of the Bible, Jesus comes, and he dies and he rises again to life. And the Jesus that rises again to life is not some sort of kind of spiritual being. He's a body, he's fleshy. He gets Thomas to put his hand into the wounds that he's got. He eats barbecued fish on the beach. He is made of the stuff that creation is made of. And there's a sense there that God loved the creation at the beginning, and God continues loving the creation through history. And then if you go right to the end of the Bible, to Revelation, the pictures there of the future are recognizably a created world. It has trees and rivers and cities and animals. And there's an early theologian called Paul who wrote some of the Bible, and you see this coming through in his thought as he talks about Jesus in a letter to the Colossians. He says Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. So he's not just talking about humans, but creation. And he says that God's plan is to reconcile, to bring back into a relationship with himself, all things. So it's not just humans, it's the whole shebang, everything he's made. So I think God cares about creation, and he has that desire to make it whole again. And not only does God care about creation, but he gives mankind a job, and that's to steward creation and not to plunder it. So in Genesis 2:15, we're told, the Lord put man in the garden to work it and keep it. So God creates mankind, puts him on earth with that job, puts us on earth. Sorry that I'm another white man talking, but my dear friend Joe, who might have done this, talks in America. This theme of man being responsible for stewarding the earth continues through the Old Testament law. There's a really interesting rule in the law book that says the land must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. So I don't know how much you know about Sabbaths. There's this idea, we have a 7-day week, and there's a kind of Christian idea that on the 7th day you rest. And God actually says that counts for the land as well. So he says, for 6 years sow your fields, 6 years prune your vineyards, gather the crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. And Duncan Green, who's the head of policy at Oxfam, not a Christian, says, true that. The planet really needs some rest. And perhaps more troublingly, the Bible suggests God's not afraid to punish his people when they don't respect ecology. One of the big moments in the Old Testament is when the people of God are sent into exile, and that's seen as God's judgment on various wrongs they've committed. And one of the wrongs is not looking after the land. So in Chronicles, which is sort of history of that time, there's this line, all the days that it lay desolate, so all the days that the farmers and the landowners were away from it. All the days the land lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So there's that link made. Land hadn't been looked after. God's judgment came so that the land could rest. God wants mankind to care for creation. I think you might find that difficult, but if you've looked at Christianity at all, you often know that those kind of basic commandments are to love God and to love your neighbour. And the poorest people are our neighbours. My genes were made in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which is mostly about 4 or 5 metres above sea level and pretty risky when it comes to the impacts of climate change. So I think God wants mankind to steward creation. God wants mankind to love our neighbour. And it's clear that we're not doing that. So there's more CO2 in the atmosphere at any point since mankind arrived on the planet, and we've put it there. 15 of the 16 warmest years on record have happened since 2000, and 2016 is already set to continue that trend. It may be the hottest year on modern record. And we're losing biodiversity. Our species extinction rate is about 1,000 or even 10,000 times what we kind of reckon the natural rate should be. And there's local impacts that you're seeing. So California is suffering the worst drought for 1,200 years. 7 of the UK's wettest years on record have happened since 1998. And this all gets worse as the world gets hotter. So in a 2-degree world, 98% of our coral reefs are at risk. Heat waves increase in length and intensity. Mediterranean holidays are not going to be fun. Rainfall increases, becomes more unpredictable but heavier, and that has impacts on food. Some crops benefit, but most crops are adversely impacted. And I think, as I said, that makes God angry. Sometimes God's wrath, God's anger, God's judgment gets a bad press. But if you care about climate change, it's perhaps good to know that there is an angry God who shares your anger and who will pass judgment on this human selfishness and fecklessness. It's a reasonably heavy way to start. So I thought I'd just talk a bit about some solutions to that problem. I used to be a speechwriter, and they tell the story of a jilted speechwriter who was annoyed with his boss and gave his boss this speech that was talking about a problem, and it said, this is the problem. This is how serious the problem is. These are all the challenges to solving this problem. These are all the bad impacts on people, on the environment, on the economy. And the boss was reading down the speech from the lectern, got to the bottom of the page, and it said, having outlined the problem, I'll now outline the solution. And he turned over the page, and the rest of the speech was blank. I never did that to my boss. So, what's God's solution? Well, actually, one I believe in is the church. And that might sound slightly weird to you, but Craig Bennett is the current chief executive of Friends of the Earth. He started, I think, about this time last year. And he's on a war against, he calls them the kind of warm white wine parties amongst the liberal metropolitan elite in London. He says there'll be no solutions to climate change that are done to people. The solutions to climate change have to be done by people and by diverse groups of people. These groups must go beyond, in his terms, the white middle class ghetto and the environment ghetto and reach out to different communities and create opportunities for them to campaign on issues that matter to them. So if you're passionate about combating climate change, in Craig's terms, you've got to find forums in which you can do this, in which you can talk across groups of diverse people. And I think that means in current society, getting out of our often self-reinforcing social media bubbles and finding the people whom we don't ordinarily interact with. The church isn't the only institution that offers that opportunity, but it is a big one. There's a vicar in London I was talking to recently who's just passed his 50th birthday, and he went to Cats College. And he said, at the moment I'm going to 2 sets of birthday parties. I'm going to birthday parties of my friends at Cats, and I'm going to birthday parties of my friends at church. He says, birthday parties of my friends at Cats, it's basically all the people we were at university with. Like, it's basically a bunch of mostly white men and some white women, all of whom have gone down to London, gone to the city, broadly lived the same life, and just had this insulated social life. He said, my church birthday parties are totally different. I have a massive spread of race, of age, of stage of life, of wealth decile, of interests. The heterogeneity there is fascinating. If you want to combat climate change, you've got to find places where you're meeting people, and meeting people who are different to you. And that makes the church a powerful campaigner. And that's not just kind of what I think. A friend of mine is called Kirsty McNeil. She runs campaigning for Save the Children, and she worked for Gordon Brown in Number 10. Again, I think she's got a bit of a faith background, but not a Christian. But she says, when you're sitting in government, the church is just frightening. Most campaigners can be talked down or bought off, but when the church gets going, you know it will keep coming back. And she was talking particularly about the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which is a campaign in 2000, which is presumably when you were all about 2, which is an incredible thought. It's when I was just first year at Christ, so there we go. The church mobilised people to campaign on third world debt. And it was a very outside issue, very random issue. Nobody really thought it would go anywhere. And in that year, they managed to get the whole of Birmingham city centre ringed with people, which meant in 2005, when you were 7, so you might just remember this, Tony Blair at the Gleneagles Summit made massive commitments to ramp down third world debt. And obviously there were other things going on, like Bono and Geldof were there, but the church was a huge player in that movement, and particularly getting it on the agenda. And I also think the church can do something deeper. If you've kind of read into climate change much, or if you've thought about how do we solve this problem, you realise that quite quickly the discussion comes round to how do we change the values of people and the values of our society. If only our society was a bit more focused on the future, on the next 50 years or 100 years, rather than the next 2 weeks or 6 months. If only it was a bit less preoccupied with itself, if it cared about, again, its neighbours around the country, let alone around the world. If only we settled for less stuff, if we just didn't define ourselves by the newest thing and having all these things. WWF did a bit of work on this if you're interested in following up. Common Cause is the kind of organisation. But I think if you care about climate change, you've got to ask yourself, what are the organisations, what are the institutions, what are the movements in society that have changed values successfully and to some extent wholesomely? And people often think, well, this is the government's job. As campaigners, we often look towards government and say, oh, we need to get government to change people's mind. Government is very bad at changing people's minds. Like, people don't like governments, they don't trust governments. Governments are quite heavy-handed. I think, in some ways, the Soviet Union was a big experiment in can you, from the centre, change people's minds? And ultimately, it kind of didn't work. It's a reasonably bold truth claim there, so any historians can take me apart in the questions. Faith isn't the only mode by which people's values and aspirations can shift, but I think it is a big one. Christianity offers the promise of changing people's hearts. When people become Christians, it might sound strange, but God promises to come in, live in them, and work on them from the inside to make them more like him. And Christianity can change the values of a society as well. We know when the Christian community first arrived in Rome, it started taking the abandoned babies in and bringing them up. And part of the growth, I think, of the church, but also of humanity in late Rome, came from those changes to understanding of human life. Christianity changed attitudes to slavery in the UK as part of the abolition campaign in the 19th century. And as I said, Christians changed public and political attitudes to third world debt. So I think as you go on in climate campaigning, if that's what you're up to, You'll have to find answers to the questions: how do I change people's hearts and a society's values? How do I bring people together in diverse groups to learn from one another and deliberate on solutions? And how do I organise campaigns that have weight so that I'm not just a lone voice? Now, is the church the only institution that can do that? No. Is it always perfect? Definitely not. And that's kind of the deal in an organisation where, acknowledging you're a sinner is the price of entry. But can it be great? I think so, and I know so. And finally, this is kind of personal. If you want to fight climate change, as you go on in life, you'll face two major challenges. And the first is the challenge of your own complicity. So I don't know if any of you know 350.org, which is a big campaigning movement. 350 is about carbon concentration in the atmosphere. We've just gone over 400. 350 is the kind of scientifically safe level, some would argue. We've gone over 400. We're heading towards 450, which is what global leaders said that they want to keep it at, and we're probably going to kind of spike straight through that. The leader there is a guy called Bill McKibben. He's a great unbowed American leader. But he says hypocrisy is the price of admission to the climate change battle. Whatever you yourself do, if you're pursuing meaningful change, you will be stuck in a society, in a system which tars you with its pollution at every opportunity, and you can never escape. You have to find some way of dealing with that hypocrisy. Now, I care about climate change. I do what I can to reduce it. I buy green energy. I'm reducing my meat consumption. I cycle. It's easy in Cambridge. I avoid plane travel. But I know that just by living, I'm impacting the environment far more than a brother or sister across the world. My carbon footprint is far from neutral, far from the negative that it probably should be in a just system. I sometimes use the car when I could cycle because it's flipping cold in Cambridge and it rains. I sometimes buy packed lunches when I'm in a hurry. I've had children, and they'll use about 600 times as much stuff as someone in poverty across the world. And I don't mean it to sound like a crutch, but I think, as Bill's, if you care about these issues, you're kind of stuck in this tension. And Christianity is a huge comfort to me when it comes to this. Because again, Christianity kind of starts from this place. It starts from the position that you are a sinner. To unpack that you fall short of the expectations you have for yourself, that you fall short of what it might mean to be perfect. And Christianity is not only about you, but it's actually about the whole society, the whole system, the whole of creation. The whole thing has fractured and broken and fallen and is out of order. And God reaches into that and he says, I want you to be better, and I want things to be better. But you have to start not with your own effort, but with my forgiveness. Your personal mess is paid for. Accept that, come to me, and then we can get to work. And not only in Christianity is your personal mess paid for, but God, in raising Jesus from the dead, fired the starting gun on putting the whole world back together. He's saying, look, I'm going to remake this creation. It's falling apart, but actually I'm going to start here, and we're going to make it good again. That's the trajectory that we're on. And this brings me to the final great benefit of Christianity when it comes to fighting climate change, because you will need a source of hope. I don't know if any of you are at the Judge doing the kind of management stuff. You might be reading management books and treatises as you kind of prep for job interviews and things like that. One of the well-known ones is a book called From Good to Great by Jim Collins, and he's looking at what separates good companies from great companies. And one of his key insights is what he calls the Stockdale paradox. He says that a great company retains faith, retains hope that it will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, but at the same time confronts the brutal facts of its current reality. And he takes the paradox from a story that Admiral Jim Stockdale told him. Jim Stockdale was a US military officer held captive for 8 years during the Vietnam War. He was tortured more than 20 times by his captors and never had much reason to believe that he would survive the prison camp and see his wife again. But he never lost faith during the ordeal. and survived. And talking to Jim, Stockdale contrasted his hope not with despair, as we might think, but with optimism. He said, "It was always the most optimistic of my prison mates who failed to make it out. They were the ones who said, 'We're going to be out by Christmas,' and Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they would say, 'We're going to be out by Easter,' and Easter would come, and Easter would go. And then they say, 'Well, we'll be out by Thanksgiving,' and Thanksgiving would come and go, and it would be Christmas again, and then they died of a broken heart." Optimists failed to confront the reality of their situation. They never found an enduring hope that stood up to reality. And for me, Jesus Christ offers the most authentic, the most gritty, the most sustaining hope, because he is a God who knows. If you believe in Christianity, he's a God who is at the beginning of all things, he's at the end of all things. He's lived this very human, ordinary life in the unfashionable end of a minor province of the Roman Empire. He suffered a brutal death, rejection by his friends, rejection by society. And he's sustained humans as civilizations, and you could argue, this current civilization perpetuating climate change is just a passing one. But Jesus has sustained people as civilizations have risen and fallen again. And in rising from death, he casts our eye forward to a future where God reigns and puts everything right, where there's no more suffering and no more pollution and no more damage and destruction and selfishness. He's that statement that God has won and will win and will spend eternity hanging out with people in a perfect world. So there you have it. I'm going to stop there. I think God hates climate change. I think the church is a good place to do something about it. I think a Christian faith will sustain you if you really want to take on the issue. You are all amazing, obviously intelligent, gifted people, individually known and loved by God, and he's given you your passions and your excitements, whether you believe in him or not. And he wants you to change the world. So go to it, really. Thanks very much.
Great, so we've got a couple of minutes now for just chatting around our tables about what we heard, and then we'll come back for questions. Sorry to cut back into your conversations, guys. We're just going to come back together. We've got just a couple of minutes for questions. So we'll start with one texted in. So first question, could you explain a bit more about the difference between hope and optimism?
Yeah. I think optimism is hoping it's going to be all right without any grounds for thinking so. Whereas hope and faith is having some reason for believing that things will work out okay in some way. Now, I think you can find, Christianity doesn't have the exclusive offer on that. But I believe that Christianity does have the most compelling offer on that.
Great. Would anyone like to come back? We'll have another question from the floor. If you do, just stick a hand up and a roving mic will come round to you. Great. Oh, sorry, just hang on for the mic so we can hear you.
Hi. Doesn't it seem somewhat unscientific to believe that we're going to be saved, even if, all metrics point to climate meltdown?
Do you mean the planet can't, humanity can't survive the coming crisis, kind of? So, as I said, I'm not a scientist. I think that we're not on a great trajectory, but we're not on an awful trajectory. So the pledges made in Paris in December brought us down from a probable 4 degrees of warming, which is reasonably catastrophic, to a probable 3 degrees of warming, and we need to get down to kind of 2 or 1.5. I think even at 4 degrees, bits of humanity survive, although the world does look very different. I think that there's kind of a question that we have to ask in our own minds, we're in this kind of wonderful civilization that's, late capitalism and kind of throws itself back right down to the I guess, Athens and Rome as its sort of foundations in many ways. That's a slightly Western-centric vision. I'm sorry about that. And that could all fall apart. And again, the question is, where are people putting their security? So if the world changes massively, what are the frameworks that actually carry people through those big transitions? And again, I think Christianity has been shown to do that. As empires rise and fall, Christianity has been has stayed with people. I think if you think that the whole thing's going to hell in a handcart and humanity is being destroyed, I sort of think, in some ways, I don't really know what to do with that. Again, it's kind of what point are you picking ethically that is saying that's either a good or a bad thing, and then also how are you comparing up that ethical framework to a Christian eschatology? I guess that sort of story of how does the future pan out in Christianity versus how does the future pan out in science, and how do we deal with that?
Okay, thank you. Another one texted in. If God doesn't like climate change, why doesn't he help out? Are the negative consequences supposed to be our punishment for doing this to the world?
Cool. So my first answer is, there was a talk like this on suffering a couple of weeks ago, and you can watch the YouTube clip on the KickU website. So go back and do that, see what they said. I think that there are obviously natural consequences. There are consequences to behaviour, and Christians would say, those are, that's kind of how the world works. If humanity pumps out pollution and the climate messes up because of it, there's a kind of cause and effect there, and that's part of this whole kind of package of what we call sin. I think whether God is somehow intensifying that, I'm not sure I'd go down that track. Now, obviously, the other bit of the question was, does God kind of step in? Could God step in and stop it? I think God, if you want God to do that, you kind of got to ask yourself, what do I want? Do I want basically a God who jumps in and changes the rules at any given moment? Or do I want a God who kind of works with the warp and weft of the created order? And what God seems to want to do is work with humans to solve problems. Most of these problems are being driven by humans, and even if the problems aren't being driven by humans, the surviving the impacts, being resilient to the impacts, is about sharing technical capacity, sharing wealth, so that you can have good building standards, so that people can build flood-resistant or typhoon-resistant houses. Again, that's kind of something that comes out of how we decide to treat our global neighbour, how we decide to carry ourselves in the world. So again, I think it kind of comes back to you and how you're going to behave in the world.
Brilliant, thanks very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for if you want just one tasty. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but Sam is going to be around afterwards, so please feel free to keep asking him about them or keep chatting on tables too. I'm aware this is a really big topic and we've just begun to scratch the surface of stuff. So there's a couple of ways that you can continue thinking about this if you'd like. So first of all, on your way out, you'll see, and there's a whole load of books. These are written by Christians and are intended to help you think through this topic or related topics more. And if you're a guest of the CU, they're free for you to take away just to help you think about it more. So please do have a look at them on the way out and take them away. You'll